In 1929, the Belgian surrealist artist René Magritte completed The Treachery of Images. The famous painting showed a pipe, and under it, this paradoxical inscription. When it was pointed out to Magritte that what he had created was in fact a pipe, he replied, "Okay, you should try filling it with tobacco then." So this is not a pipe, but a painting of a pipe, a thin layer of pigments suspended in oil over a piece of canvas. Well, this is not Magritte's original, so it's really a poster of a painting of a pipe. Just a grid of multi-sized ink dots of black and primary colors. Of course, on your screen, this is not a poster, but a combination of red, green, and blue light frequencies. And as this animation was created digitally, what you've been watching all along is merely a collection of flickering multicolored pixels. But regardless of the technique used to represent the pipe, or anything else for that matter, Magritte's warning remains unchanged. Beware of the seductive and deceptive power of images. The earliest known man-made representations date back to over 30,000 years ago. Some archaeologists believe that the cave paintings depict visions experienced by Cro-Magnon shamans during ritualistic trance dances. Others believe that the spear marks found on some cave walls point to hunting rituals. What is certain is that since then, the belief that images hold supernatural powers has been embraced by cultures around the world. Simplified drawings evolved into the first pictographic languages, with each word being represented by a unique symbol. But these systems became impractical as multilingual markets emerged. As the Phoenicians sailed from ancient Lebanon to trade across the Mediterranean, the need for a better notation system gave birth to the first alphabet in history. By transforming images into 22 phonetic place markers, a society of merchants who left no significant works of literature invented the tool that all future literature would depend on. Glorious epics and religious manuscripts would follow, and with them, countless depictions of gods, rulers, warriors, and sages. For thousands of years, different societies developed unique visual systems to honor and worship their deities. But as varied as these systems were, they all featured a flat, two-dimensional aesthetic. An Islamic ban on figurative art, the adoption of Hindu numerals, and a passion for mathematics drove Muslim artists to develop some of the most intricate geometric patterns. And while these artists were not allowed to reference real objects in their work, the Arab Caliphate's introduction of advanced mathematics into Europe greatly influenced figurative art and led to the development of a major breakthrough in representation. In 1413, the Florentine architect Filippo Brunelleschi demonstrated the geometrical method of linear perspective, and for the first time in history, painters were able to accurately represent three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. The depth and realism achieved with this technique were so mesmerizing, it quickly gained the patronage of the Roman Catholic Church. By seamlessly blending the real world with that of religious mythology, the evangelical powers of perspective would spread all over Europe. Its embrace was so enthusiastic that the Church failed to realize the threat it posed to the religious establishment. Influenced by medieval thinkers such as Maimonides and St. Thomas Aquinas, Catholic doctrine became heavily reliant on Aristotelian logic, so it rejected the numeral zero and the concept of infinity, while praising the law of identity and the geocentric universe. If we analyze a perspective painting, we realize that everything tends to converge towards a vanishing point. The closer we get to this point, the more of the universe we can see. By this logic, when we reach an impossibly small, non-dimensional point, a universe would be contained within it. Zero and infinity, two of Aristotle's most challenging rivals, were concealed in every fresco. The venerable law of identity collapsed, as nothing and everything became one and the same. Moreover, perspective provided geometrical confirmation that a spatial infinity existed in every direction, and, by definition, An infinite space could have no discernible center. The evidence against geocentrism, which declared the Earth as the center of the universe and the Church its one true faith, was now on display in every chapel. The medium had become the message. Still, perspective paintings proliferated. After all, the few scholars who could decipher the riddle worked for the Vatican, and any dissenter could be silenced. Dominican friar Giordano Bruno supported the notion of an infinite universe and was burned at the stake. But religious congregations were mostly illiterate and could not recognize the implications embedded in these paintings. In fact, widespread illiteracy was one of the reasons to proselytize through images in the first place. However, the prohibitive cost of literacy soon decreased, thanks to a tremendous leap in broadcasting technology. In 1450, Gutenberg developed the printing press, and 5 years later released the first mass-produced books. For ordinary people, this meant unprecedented access to an affordable source of education. For the Church, it represented a challenge. By 1530, when Henry VIII declared himself head of the English clergy, the press had already spread all over Europe and was instrumental in disseminating the ideas of the Protestant Reformation. When the English king undermined the power of the Pope, the Vatican struck back with stiffer censorship and a return to strict orthodoxy. Such was the environment when Pope Urban VIII ordered Galileo to stand trial for heresy. After receiving a tour of the Inquisition's torture chambers, Galileo publicly rejected heliocentrism. Being an influential public figure and former private tutor of the Medicis, his life was spared, but his books were banned, and he was forced to spend the rest of his life under house arrest. And books were not the only medium being censored. In 1599, the brilliant artist Michelangelo Caravaggio was commissioned to decorate the walls of the Contarelli Chapel. In his daring depiction of St. Matthew, Caravaggio presented a humble and illiterate tax collector, sitting in a clumsy cross-legged posture with rough bare feet and a puzzled expression. A forbidden interaction between the earthly and heavenly domains takes place as the angel gently guides his hand to write the gospel. This intrepid masterwork was met with strong rejection and had to be completely recreated. Like the original, the second version was aesthetically superb, but was now in compliance with the Church's agenda. In 1622, Pope Gregory XV established a Counter-Reformation and evangelical organization to spread the faith across the Asian, African, and American colonies. Due to the diverse languages of the many regions, images became critical in its missionary efforts. The Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith is the origin of the word propaganda, but the term's widespread use arose from the events of World War I. It's easy to forget that non-utilitarian art is a modern invention, and that the beautifully rendered paintings which hang in museums today once served propagandistic purposes. The Parisian artist Jacques-Louis David was a good friend of Marat and a supporter of the French Revolution. Feared and hated by many as the man whose denunciations caused countless beheadings, Marat was eventually murdered. An unattractive man, Marat suffered from a terrible skin condition which kept him confined to a bathtub. That, and the massive blood loss from a severed aorta, would have resulted in a particularly gruesome scene. However, this Christ-like depiction became the most emblematic image of its time, and the way Marat was immortalized. In 1801, Jacques-Louis David depicted Napoleon bravely leading his troops across the Alps on top of an Arabian stallion. In reality, Napoleon had been led across by a guide a few days behind his troops, mounted on a mule. For centuries, painters were instrumental in idealizing conflict and its participants, but in 1826, a new medium would come to challenge that. After serving under Napoleon, the French inventor Nicephore Niepce went on to patent the first internal combustion engine, as well as the photographic process. His partner, Louis Daguerre, perfected that process and, in 1839, sold it to the French government, which immediately placed it in the public domain. France's gift to the world quickly changed the nature of documentation. For the first time in history, a large segment of the population could create visual records of their own lives, as well as the lives of others. In 1888, the American inventor George Eastman patented the first consumer camera. Using flexible film instead of dry plates, the Kodak would play a key role in the emergence of motion pictures. That same year, but across the Atlantic, the Scottish veterinarian John Boyd Dunlop was also patenting a revolutionary invention. Dunlop's 10-year-old son loved riding his tricycle, but the cobblestone streets of Belfast caused the child terrible migraines. By replacing the tricycle's metal wheels with inflatable rubber, Dunlop helped his son enjoy a smoother ride. He also created a whole new industry, one that would explode with the advent of the automobile at the end of the century. By 1900, George Eastman was selling $1 cameras, and one of them found its way to the Congo, where British missionary Alice Seeley Harris used it to document her work at the Balolo mission. At the time, the Congo was privately owned by Leopold II, King of Belgium. The Central African region had been dismissed by other colonizers as an impenetrable and worthless jungle. But this jungle turned out to be covered in rubber trees. The insatiable need for rubber created by the pneumatic industry turned the Congo into a very profitable business. One day, an exhausted man arrived at the Balolo mission. He was carrying a small bundle under his arm. He unwrapped the contents to reveal the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter, who had been mutilated and murdered for failing to collect enough rubber. Alice Harris used her camera to document this event, and then traveled the region recording countless atrocities. By then, millions of men, women, and children had been tortured and murdered. Roger Casement, the British consul in Congo, had already created the Congo Reform Association to expose the atrocities. But the Belgian king actively bribed the news media to ridicule his findings as old wives' tales. It was the publication of Alice's photographs that shocked the world and, through public pressure, forced Leopold to relinquish his land. For his efforts to protect the indigenous people of Peru and Congo, Casement is considered the father of the modern human rights movement. His collaboration with Alice Harris and journalist Edie Morel would lay the grounds for the emergence of groups such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Regardless of technique and agenda, images have proved to be powerful tools of propaganda. Unlike text, they are consumed rapidly and viscerally, so they often trigger impulsive and absolute reactions. In that respect, the persuasion efforts of the governments involved in World War I were not that different from what had been attempted in the past. But by then, the introduction of new mass media such as radio, cinema, pictorial magazines, and telegraphic news services allowed for an unprecedented reach and coordination. On April 10, 1917, citing German military sources, a Belgian newspaper published the most revolting news. The Germans were boiling their dead soldiers and turning them into lubricating oil, cooking fat, soap, glue, hog feed and fertilizer, as well as glycerin for munitions. The story was picked up and corroborated by the London Times and gained worldwide circulation. The Lancet, Britain's top medical journal, examined the scientific and technical aspects of the corpse factory business. These reports reignited an intense hatred towards the Germans, increased British military recruitment, and played a key role in turning China against Germany. Oh, and by the way, they were a complete fabrication, orchestrated by the British Intelligence Service. After serving in World War I, the aspiring artist Adolf Hitler became a member of the National Socialist Party and designed its flag. The Nazi visual identity system would evolve into one of the most aesthetically alluring and consistently powerful visual identity systems ever created. In his 1925 book, Mein Kampf, Hitler explains his desire to incorporate Vedic, runic, and Nordic symbols into his party's iconography, as he considered them part of a Germanic antiquity associated with the Aryan master race. He also wrote about a propaganda technique based on the corpse factory deception. He called it the big lie, a lie so colossal it gains absolute credibility. Why? Because all are convinced that no one would have the means and audacity to distort the truth to such an extent.